Hello and welcome to a kind of a informal late night episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. I was ruminating over some things with a friend of mine online, and we were talking about the Matrix and kind of where that could go. And it reminded me that there was a line of thought that I wanted to be able to put down at some point just to frame the way that this channel and I approach a lot of issues. And I thought it would be kind of fun to just do an off the cuff discussion, and we'll open up the phone lines in a little bit to get some more interactive participation. But if you're familiar, if you've seen recent episodes with a guy named Chris Hanna that we had on before to talk about Rappaport's rules and ways to engage people who think differently about controversial issues. I'm going to bring Chris on board now, and we're just going to kind of dive into this head first. So let's see here. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I got Yugi here. He's sporting a Hawaiian shirt, so he's like chilling.
He's
He looks
cute.
eerily like I do when I'm out and about, but he needs a haircut too. Dude, you gonna let me do this? Okay, you should be sleeping. All right. So, so Chris, I wanted to kind of just have you to bounce some ideas off of, and this is something that we were talking about the Matrix and how it is kind of like Plato's allegory of the cave at one level, but they intended it to be something that was maybe even a little bit deeper than that or more meta than that. And you probably understand the whole Baudrillardian hyper reality thing more than I do.
A little
I
bit.
want to kind of talk, it's kind of like, so I have like these ideas that pop into my head about metaphors and ways that I want to convey different things. One of them was, the story in The Labyrinth, the movie The Labyrinth, where she has to go and talk to the two representatives in front of the door. And she's told that one of them will always tell the truth and one of them will always lie. And it's a classic logical conundrum. And so she figures it out. She asks the question of one of them about what the other one would say if they were asked which door was the right one to go to. And if you work that out like logically in your brain, it should work. And then she walks through the door that logical conclusion should go through, and she still falls. It was still the wrong door. And I always felt betrayed by that part of the movie because I'm like, this is how it's supposed to work. But it points to something that's very true and very real, and that is that she was told the rules of the game by somebody who himself was not trustworthy. And so she was told the logical operation, that the rules that defined that reality there, but she was told it by Jareth, who was, or, whoever it was, is an unreliable narrator. And so if the reality was that it didn't matter which door she chose, she was still going to fall. But she was given like a false conception of what it is. So it's even like the reality that she shaped, like what she was doing there, her choices and everything was a complete fiction. It was real to her because she accepted it as reality, but it wasn't actually what it was. So, I mean, that concept was something that kind of got me thinking about, in Mormonism, we deal with what it means to be Mormon. And there's this reality that you have about what, like, who you are as a member of the church. You are God in embryo. And that's kind of your identity. But there's a purpose on top of that, which is what you're supposed to be doing. You're navigating this life, choosing the right, enduring to the end. And that is going to give you the opportunity to be a God. So that's what it means to be a Mormon. But what does it mean to be a Scientologist? Well, if you're a Scientologist, you are this being that's inhabited by Thetans. But then what is your narrative? What's the story that defines what your purpose is? Well, you have to make yourself clear by doing all of these different things in the hopes that this particular cycle of your life will elevate you somewhat. I don't know if any of this makes sense here, but these are all just like little drops of ideas that kind of eventually crystallized into something that I want to hit you with, and then I want to hear what you think about. And it's a line of different things. Any questions before we start? Because right now, this is weird. I have a lot to say, and I don't know. I haven't talked about this for you before, so it may just be you listening for a little bit. But if anything pops up, pop in.
I'll try to ride the wave of the thinker of thought. So I think you flow a little bit like I do sometimes, where it's pulling like 50 different things into the same idea. I trust you.
Okay.
It's gonna pan out.
Okay. So what
I
I'm
feel
going to
where
do
you're going
first.
already.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the screen because it's kind of like I haven't put this together yet, but I sort of want to put it together while we're talking. So I'm going to do something a little bit weird, which is to bring up a Google slide presentation and just kind of bring it on the screen while we're doing this here. Okay, so this is basically 4 different concepts that I think are all important, and they all make the whole. And the first one to understand is ideology. The second one is dogma. The third one is identity. And actually, so this makes a better name. I'm going to make it narrative is the third one, and then identity is the fourth one. We probably won't treat it in that order, but it at least makes idni as something that is maybe easier to have. Okay, so if I bring these like this, then that gives me something to work with here. You have to bear with me. You're getting my PowerPoint skills in the middle of this, which are not all that. For those 14 losers who have nothing better than to listen to a rant this evening, feel free to chat away in the comments, and I'll probably post a link if anyone wants to join in just by video. If you happen to have a camera, you're welcome to do that too. We'll kind of play around with this. Okay, so how do I get these centered here? Text align. Okay, so we're going to center. Okay, so now we're going to go and we're going to do the first one. Okay, and so this is what's important, I think, to define. So we've got to define our terms. So the first one is going to be ideology. If you were going to define someone what ideology is, how would you define it? Because I think this is really important.
Oh boy.
I can tell you where I would start, and maybe you can tell me what you think about that.
Sure. I was just going to say, because I was just going to piece it from the start. In my view, whenever I use ideology, I'm probably using too extreme of a definition, but I usually think it's somebody's trying to give an all-encompassing description of how reality works, or how their world works, or how it's kind of like a theory for life. But when it hits level of ideology, it's like you believe you really understand or follow all the substrates of everything that we're doing here in this world.
Well,
I don't know.
It's kind of like a lot of times we use it as a pejorative term. Like you can say, well, you're acting ideologically, or you are an ideologue. And so it's almost like if you're brainwashed, then the thing that you're brainwashed with is the ideology. And so we use it as a negative term. But I want to step back from that. And I want to be as broad and as encompassing as possible. And so I think the way that I would frame it is very similar to what you're talking about, but even more general, so it doesn't have to be that. So I'm going to say that an ideology is a, let's see, how do I make this a bullet? Okay, we're going to do bullets.
Do you think no matter what, you have to have an ideology at some level?
Absolutely. I think that's, so what we're going to say is it's a system, or let's say it's a set of connected beliefs or ideas. Okay. It operates as a web where some of the ideas and beliefs are dependent on others.
It's a descriptive and prescriptive framework, usually.
What do you mean by that?
Um, Usually it has
What is the difference between something that's descriptive and something that's prescriptive?
uh, one's trying to partially describe the reality that we live in, or yeah, I keep going back to the word reality, even though I think
Yeah.
so many times ideologies don't 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 seem to be trying very hard
Well,
with that one. But the
we have
the
one suggestion from a viewer. Flip Johnson says a set of ideas that one uses to interpret the world. I think
yeah,
that's a good way to start with it. Let's put a pause on the descriptive versus prescriptive thing, because I think that will be a natural extension of where this goes. But if you were to look up, like we can do this actually here, if you were to look up, okay, well, if we were going to do the Mormon thing, every Mormon loves to look up the definition so they can, the
or to
dictionary
talk.
says that ideology is a system of ideas,
The start
especially
of
one which forms the, yeah,
yeah.
which forms the basis for economic or political theory. So I don't think we even need the last part of this. I think any set of system or ideas that somebody uses is an ideology. And the other aspect of this is that some people might think that if you use the word ideology, it has to encompass everything. But I want to say that it can be general and refer to a way that you look at everything, but it can also be compartmentalized. There
It's
may
hard to,
be a
because
particular.
certain things you would call an ideology, somebody might use two different ideologies to create their own ideology.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, and this is where, when you are as broad as possible, when you simply say it's whatever set of ideas that you are using to look at the world or to look at yourself or to look at a situation, that set of ideas that are connected and make some sort of internal sense are your ideology. Now, we're not talking right now about whether or not the ideology is legitimate or not, because that's a completely separate question. We're just talking about the set of ideas that you bring to it. And this is, one of the comments that I got on the YouTube channel about one of the videos was that all you ex-Mormons don't realize that you're as bad as the church in, you're criticizing the church for being ideological and for having its false ideology, when you don't realize that you yourself have, you just have your own ideology. And so this speaks to the concept that you talked about a second ago, which is that you always have to have an ideology, and that's absolutely true. The only way that we can operate in the world is to have a set of ideas that we can rely on, that we think are true. And there's something perhaps a little bit, I don't know if it's Derridian in terms of just like the fact that you have language, that you have words that have some meaning that is derived from somewhere, that you have some confidence that if you use them, the people who hear your words will be able to extract that meaning, is a form of ideology in that it has some sort of linguistic application to it. So there's kind of invisible layers of ideology, but I don't need to get that fancy or French or postmodern or anything like that. All you have to just say is it's whatever set of ideas that you're using, because that's kind of the big overview idea. Does that make sense?
yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we're going to say it's a set of connected beliefs or ideas. It operates as a web where some of the ideas are dependent on others, and it can be general or compartmentalized. Now, that thing about general or compartmentalized, we are very flexible when it comes to these ephemeral things, like ways that you look at stuff. So somebody may be like I was a physician and I was Mormon. And so in the realm of science, in the realm of medicine, I would try to apply to my greatest ability and rigor logic, rationality, evidence-based justification for things that I would believe in terms of therapy or in terms of approaches to illness. And so there was an ideology around medicine and evidence and science that I used in that realm of my life, but it was compartmentalized from the realm of faith. And so I had a different set of ideological principles that I never challenged one with the other because I never tried to make them fit together in my life. I had one compartment for one and one compartment for the other. And so I kind of want to just point out that when we talk about these ideologies, you as a human may have multiple sets of ideologies that you use like a toolbox where you pull out one when you need it in one realm of your life and pull out others in another. Can you relate to that? Did you have anything similar to that in your own experience?
My mine was only a little different in that my entire life I struggled to actually like fully believe. But I get well, the compartmentalized part was that I was better at believing the negative parts than I was at believing positive parts. Like I was always kind of like, oh, just to be general, just like, oh, there's a heaven. Like, yeah, right. There's a Satan. Oh yeah, yeah. I kind of, So that's kind
Mm-hmm.
of one of the things that um one of the only things that would kind of flow with me. Although, as far as like figuring out like scientific method and all that stuff, my dad, if he ever watched this, he gets mad at himself because he sometimes thinks he didn't do a good job at answering my scientific questions when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Because I'd be a little kid asking what about the dinosaurs and what about all that sorts of stuff, and I'd kind of get the thing of shut up and go to bed, or don't bring that up right now, and he kind of feels like he should have been answering those questions right and all that stuff. And I started with that stuff from a young age, but I'm also kind of constantly aware because you're talking about Mormonism. I'm aware of other places in my life and things that I do believe where I contradict myself and run into contradictions where I can't jive two different things. And so it might not be like related to Mormonism, but you find it out like in the workout world all the time. You find it out in something as simple as like music taste or something like that. You can like say, I never like this, I never like this, I never like this. And then it turns out you like something else, and in some level you're compartmentalizing lie
Mm-hmm.
to yourself about what your own ideology was. And,
Yeah.
um,
Well, it's kind of a way to start because I think the things that I want to have people accept at this stage is that we kind of all operate from a set of ideas or beliefs. And our own conception about the rules that we use to calibrate how we look at the world and look at ourselves, we may have some confidence that it's the same way that someone we're talking with sees the world. And we may assume that they have a similar ideology to us, but that's not always the case. That's one dimension. But I want to get into the next dimension about ideology, which I think is really important. Because when we look at each of those different sets of beliefs or ideas that kind of like bricks in a structure fit together to form the edifice of the whole, each of those beliefs or ideas can have their legitimacy challenged and tested to see if they are true or false, because each of these beliefs or ideas may or may not comport with the real world if you actually test them. And so you could have an ideology built of beliefs that are all established to a very high degree of certainty, or you could have a set of beliefs in which there are certain key foundational things that are not ever tested or challenged. And so you don't know if they're false or not. But what I want to draw all of these ideas down and distill them to is the concept of dogma. And so let's make our next slide over here to be, and this is something, I'm going to go out and fill out in more detail and more concisely later. But the next important principle is dogma. So, what is your understanding of the concept of dogma? If someone was to say, Chris, define dogma.
well, since we've already been going on descriptions of ideology, I'd put it pretty close to that. Only it's completely rigid. It's not willing to change in the face of anything. But
Okay.
I mean, just hearing the word as well too, I'd sometimes add some sort of like level of. It's not always got something supernatural to it, but you hear it and you think supernatural sometimes.
Okay.
I'm gonna refuse to look up the definitions. I'm gonna try to go
I'm
off of
looking it up. I'm sorry, dude.
I'm gonna go off of what my
Well,
brain,
you're just like
the
your
Doridian, since you
vernacular
brought that up,
understanding.
yeah, or just try to describe what I think of it, because I mean, we all feel like we
Well,
know what that word means or something, but
yeah.
yeah, I define it as
Well,
rigid, and when I hear it, I think of usually something supernatural is
something
involved with it.
supernatural. Right. And I would say that the aspect of that supernatural element is when you start to assert things that derive their origin from the supernatural realm, that's suddenly in the realm of something you can't test. And if you're
Hmm.
dealing particularly in a religious paradigm, it's something that you can't challenge. You can't even, it would be considered wrong of you to even question it.
Yeah,
And
so
so if
that's
we look at the dictionary definition, because I want to have this to start from, it says a principle or set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true. And so you can think of the different contexts where people will use this. It's not only religion. People will refer to political dogma, economic dogma. Basically, anytime you want to try to insult somebody's ideas by saying they've never really thought about it, they haven't questioned it, you can just call it dogma. If you want to accuse someone of acting based on ideas that were handed to them that they never actually challenged or questioned, then you could say that they were acting dogmatically. They were simply doing and acting out of the conclusion or the demands of an idea without ever actually asking the question whether it was right or wrong. Then they're acting dogmatically. So we're going to say it's
nothing about metaphysics in the official definition of that at all. Nothing about that. Maybe like part two or
not
something.
no.
No, it can
Well,
just
I
be
mean,
it can
what
be
would you add
ideas.
to it?
They're
Oh, wait,
all
hold on. We got synonyms: convictions, tenets, principles, articles of faith, codes of belief, ideology, orthodoxy, blind faith, unquestioned belief, certainty, invincible conviction, unchallengeable, arrogant conviction.
so nothing
So
really ties it officially to the supernatural. So I was wrong about that. I'm saying that it has to, or I mean, it's just what comes to my mind with it, because usually that's the type of belief. But
wasn't there a Kevin Smith movie called Dogma
yeah,
or
yeah,
something like that? Yeah,
yeah. Chris
if
Rock
I remember right,
and
they like took the idea. Okay, what if all the Catholic uh, angelic creatures were actually real and kind of made a movie out of that or something like that. Um, if I recall correctly, Alan Rickman is in there, and he's the first on-screen performance of a TK smoothie, if I recall correctly. We'll have to look that up.
I only saw it once. I remember Chris Rock is in it. I think Matt Damon's in it, but like as a smaller role or something. And I don't remember much.
Okay, so we're going to say that dogma is rigid, ideas that cannot be a challenge. They are asserted by authority. They are you are not well. We can say things that are there's something where the nature of an idea prevents it from being challenged or questioned, and then there's something where you could challenge or question it, but then you would have to pay a very high social price because the social milieu in which you exist would immediately mark you as wrong think for challenging it or questioning it. So I think the ideas that cannot be challenged, asserted by authority, doubters or critics are demonized.
Shun the non-believer.
Yep, shun the non-believer. Okay, so I think now this is related to ideology because you can have ideologies as structures that are built out of bricks that are all dogma that cannot be challenged or questioned. And it's important because we all have an ideology, no matter where we are. It's important for us to pause and step back and say, wait a second, what of this whole set of beliefs that I take as true, are any of these beliefs existing in my mind as dogma, where I either have never questioned them or never challenged them? or there's a kind of veil over my ability to challenge them because I know I would pay a very high social price. Because that if you never question that, if you never interrogate your beliefs for that, you might not realize that a lot of the things that you believe are true, or that you assume everybody believes are true, has never actually been challenged and is actually existing as a dogma in your set of beliefs. And um, and so that's the next part of this, and we're going to see where all of this comes together, and then we're going to look at some examples. Now we have another suggestion from a viewer. Mark Flintus says, ideas that cannot be challenged, not because they've been proven through presentation of evidence, but rather through charismatic authoritarian leadership. And I think that element where there's some form of authority that has asserted this dogma, and you trust the authority and validate the legitimacy of the dogma because of the claimed authority, then that's another thing that you want to be wary of, or you want to think about when considering the question of if your ideas and beliefs are formed through dogma. And so hopefully if you're approaching these ideas from here, you could tell somebody that it sounds like what they're operating through is an ideology, and that's not a bad thing because we all have an ideology, but that some of the assertions of what they're talking about may fall under the category of dogma, in that they are things that they've accepted without question, that they've never challenged, or may be unfamiliar with the fact that there are challenges to it that would disprove it. And so that's an important thing to put in this puzzle. Anything else that comes to mind on this concept? And I know you're not quite sure where we're going, but I think these are the main things that come to my mind in terms of where I want to go with this discussion.
No, I like stopping and thinking about it, because the two concepts obviously are going to overlap. So,
yeah. And what I would say is that these two concepts of dogma and ideology form kind of like a jewel that is a little bit separate from the next two that we'll cover. And the next two are connected themselves in kind of a little capsule. And then when we put them both together, these two sets together, you'll see where there's a real power there. Okay, so next, let's do, let's see, I'm clicking on the wrong screen here. Let's do a next slide layout is going to be, and I think here I would rather put identity
before narrative.
Next, before narrative. And I guess there's a reason for that, which I would say is, it's kind of like, have you ever played Minecraft?
I've watched my nephew play it.
Okay, so you're put in this world, and it's a sandbox game. So there's no thing that you have to do. You're just a person. You exist in this world. You know that you can get tools. You have to survive, and you can just create. And there's no thing to when I got into it fairly early on, when it was still before it was ever bought out by Microsoft, and there was no ender game. Now they include an end boss monster that you can get to or whatever. But when it first started out, there was no goal. It was just pure creation. So you were a Minecraft dude, and that's all you were. You had abilities. They kind of formed the identity of who you were, but there was no story. There was no narrative to it. But so I want to talk about identity, because identity speaks to just the nature of your being. How would you describe identity if you were to just take this word to its bare, naked form? Think of
descriptor of the being. I was going to use the word self, but that probably doesn't always go, because
so there is a concept of self incorporated into that. So you have biological, and this is where I haven't really thought through a lot of these things, so I'm kind of spitballing with you of these things. So you have your biological reality, in that you are a tangible being made of stuff. And we're not going to go into the brain in the vat philosophical exercise at this point. We're just going to take the straightforward
You keep
reality that we
blocking me
have.
from the Deridian stuff. I guess that comes with
I know.
narrative.
Okay, so Mark is joining the conversation and saying that behavior traits, physical traits that define one's identity.
I like the word ones there because I kept thinking self, and it's
Yeah.
but it's, I mean, I also have to kind of figure out what another's identity is.
Yeah.
So it's not
Okay.
just the self.
So it's there is something there where you're figuring out, and this is one of the things that I think in early childhood development that psychologists have identified, that there's a point at which, as an infant growing into a toddler and adolescent, you're learning that there's something different between you and others, that you start to codify. So just like the sense of self as distinct from others, it includes your senses, abilities, I'll say volition. Just we'll speak Mormonese and we'll say agency.
So this is one I've heard come up over the years on the internet. I mean, obviously it's part of, wider philosophical concepts, but is identity negotiated, with others? Like,
Mm-hmm.
are you able to just, I mean, it might be where you're going, but declare what your identity is when it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
reflect anything whatsoever? Like, say I identify as, well, that's probably the direction you're heading. But how much does the word need to reflect what's visible, what's tangible? I mean, I guess the five senses that we have.
Yeah. Well, and this is where you're touching a little bit on your identity actually can be shaped by your ideology, because whether you see yourself as being able to assert your identity through fiat by simply declaring what your identity is can be shaped by how you conceptualize identity, which is the ideology that you hold around the notion of identity. Beyond that, an identity can give you a sense of the nature of your existence. And that's where you could look at the example of Scientology, where if you were to take a freeze frame of a Scientologist in their life, there's a set of beliefs that determine why they are in any given situation. And that is that they are this being that's inhabited by thetans that are causing problems with their life, and that they have the potential to be more through complying with those things. And so I guess the difference that I want to try in my brain when I think of identity, I'm thinking of, when I think of this Minecraft character, this person as they exist. Okay. There's no story. It's just kind of what they are. And then now you take Minecraft Dungeons, and Minecraft Dungeons now gives you something that you need to do. It goes to that next level, because just existing and defining yourself, trying to find out who you are as a individual, is different from your purpose, from the role that you play in the story of your life, in the story of society, in the story of whatever context you find yourself in. And that's where we'll get to the next element of this, which is narrative. Now, what would you say is, like, if you were going to describe conceptually what, and again, narrative is a word that gets applied to many different things. Right now, I want to think about it as how it applies to an individual who occupies an identity. And after we get through this, we're going to actually take these four things and we're going to look at some examples and see how you could and analyze them on these four dimensions. So, narrative.
Probably just a synonym, but you think the word story,
Mm-hmm.
the word story and narrative both seem like there's something in progress in both of them. Although I guess narrative could be something that happened in the past, but
Okay, so there's a story that's at play.
yeah.
There is some form of progression or evolution. There
And
are
there's
motives.
descriptions again. There's descriptions and all that.
Yep. There are motives, incentives, and punishments.
Intentions.
Okay. Intentions, goals. All of these things really drive, for me, I see purpose as being kind of the driving force of the narrative. You know, the narrative is the story that leads you to the purpose.
That's a good word.
And so the story that you find yourself in is something that gives you a purpose to reach the end of that story, whatever it is. Mark is asking, are we just defining and later tying them together? I think that's probably a pretty good thing. Right now, I just want to brainstorm this. I get things that pop into my head that I'm like, I want to talk about this in some sort of formal way, but then life gets in the way and it's hard to do it. And so I was just realizing I need to at least start thinking through this a little bit more formally to make sure that I'm doing it justice.
I'm riding the wave with you, Mark, but I think it is getting all tied together. I think there is a purpose.
Okay. Flip is asking, narratives are usually instructive in that there's some form of, well, I mean, you could say education is just, it's kind of like part of the character's arc. You know, the journey of the classic Campbell character's arc is a narrative, but it has a purpose. It has evolution. It has growth. It has conflict. But all of those things are done with a sense of where you're going and what your goals are. And all of that kind of melds together as a purpose. And again, I was trying to think of a good way to do this. And for me, it's the difference between you in a Minecraft universe where there's really no purpose. It's just kind of there versus you in a story-based game where you have choices and goals and things that you have to do. Okay, so we've got these. We've got these four things.
I don't know if that's off topic with this one, but like with this word, oh man,
Yu-Gi-Oh stepped on the keyboard.
I think beyond all the other ones, but I think that one's got more narrative, has more of a possibility for play in it, in the sense that it can just totally not have to reflect reality. I mean, it can be just completely off. It can be a game.
Well, let's play with that a little bit now, because I think you're alluding to something that is important to understand about this. So I'm going to just take this slide and I'm going to duplicate it, and then we're just going to move it here to the end, because now the question is, to what extent do any of these shape the other? And I guess if I was going to arrange these things and break them up, I probably would want to do this. I would want to create a shape here. We'll just call this shape we'll do that here, and we'll put this there, boop. And then I will go into here and hit that. And we'll do something along the lines of this, boop, 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 boop. Okay, so we've got something for ideology, and I'm gonna make it smaller because the question is the chicken and the egg question. Which one comes first? Which one shapes the others? if you had to order it in some sort of ranking, how would you do that?
My mind immediately goes to two different things. One's the long-term evolution of humans, and one's like the developmental, like psychology of an individual, and guessing where they would start. I would guess and this is just my guess because I'm sure it's been labeled out by developmental psychology.
Okay, so Chris is having mic issues. All
There
right,
we
let's
go.
see here. Narrative.
Am I back on?
Yeah, you're here.
Okay. I think. Oh gosh, chicken or egg.
So let me tell you what I'm thinking, and you can tell me.
Individual, with an individual, I think the first thing you start trying to figure out is your identity. I think.
Okay, that's a brilliant statement. Okay, is that true though? And there's a way to kind of challenge that assertion and figure out if your identity is the thing you start with, then how do you explain the difference between the fact that Mormons believe that they are gods in embryo and Jehovah's Witnesses believe that they are children of Jehovah with no potential to be God? But each of them would say that those things are central to their identity. I mean, we have this idea. President Nelson his big thing was reminding the millennials that their true identity, their core identity, are children of God, and shaping everything by the theology and the doctrine of Mormonism. So I think that your identity, to that extent, you can see that it really is shaped by these inputs that are at least by ideology. So what I'm going to assert, because I've tried to piece this together in a way that makes logic, is that you can start out with ideas, and this is where you might take dogma and say these are ideas, some of which are dogma, and others of which are proven to a reasonable degree of certainty that is subject to revision as more data becomes available. But the central thing there, though, is to be wary of. The central thing to be wary of is dogma. So I'm just going to condense that down to dogma for the purpose of the discussion here when we look at these different ways that this plays out. The dogma is what goes into your ideology, because the ideology is composed now of multiple interconnected ideas. In the case of when you have these manipulated identities, interconnected ideas that are dogmatic, they don't comport with the objective real world, but they make up your ideology. And now your ideology has a play in two different realms. And so I would say that it's going to kind of go like this. And we're going to say that your ideology shapes both your identity and your narrative. Now, if I was to ask you to, take that assertion that I just made, that your ideology shapes both your narrative and your identity, can you make sense of how that's true in the realm of Mormonism, since that's what we're familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, most of this kind of gets back to the those eternal questions of social construction versus biology, that type of issue, like what soup you're born into, and that sort of issue. So part of it is what external factors are working on you and what internal factors are working on you. And I was initially thinking about it internally, how you might start cognitively sorting it out in your life to actually be able to describe it, but it all obviously starts working on you long before you are actually thinking that way. And so definitely you're born into a soup and you're baked in that soup, or cooked in that soup, I guess is the word. And
Yeah, I mean, I think in Mormonism, it doesn't come naturally. You have to learn these ideas, and you learn it through something as simple as singing in primary, I am a child of God. Just like that song itself is something that is an articulation of an ideology that is built out of dogmatic assertions about the nature of God, the nature of us in relation to God, but it casts a spell that both gives us an identity as children of God and gives us a narrative as to what our purpose is when you go through the rest of that song. Um, he has sent me here with parents kind and dear, lead me, guide me, walk beside me. And then it goes on more into our goal eventually to return with him and to have a heavenly family, an eternal family. All those things are, I guess, part of that spell that's woven. Now, this is kind of, I'm being overly simplistic about it, but the reason that I want to map this out is because when you go to trying to figure out where you stand, whether or not you occupy an ideology that is shaping both how you define yourself, the role that you place yourself in life, in society, and whether or not any of that can be traced back to dogma. Because if you unplug the dogma from your ideology, it may have serious implications for your identity and your role in life, your purpose in life, your story in life. And so that's like, if I was to say my own journey in coming out of Mormonism, as soon as I examined the facts surrounding the claims of Mormonism as the one true church, as having a prophet who received authentic divine communication about our state as children of God, our potential future, the hoops I would have to jump through to get to that future, and everything else, all of that was traced back to these original assertions that those divine communications with that prophet were real, that he was actually a prophet. And once I saw that an examination of the history disproved those sources of the authority that legitimized the dogma, then I could take the dogma and unplug it. Okay, it's not the true church. He wasn't really a prophet. Most of what he said was just his opinion. It wasn't God's truth. And so I can challenge those opinions now and criticize them. But when you take that dogma out, suddenly my ideology is completely changed. Because I now no longer can say, well, if I have a question about some moral principle, well, what have the brethren said? Because they are God's mouthpieces, so I can just rely on that. Well, I can no longer rely on that, so I've got to start thinking about it myself. And when you realize, well, that includes now my role, my identity as a child of God in the Mormon context is no longer legitimate. And I've got to rediscover and redefine what my identity is because I've lost all of that. And also the story about the purpose that I have in life is gone. And so it's it's a huge mind fuck to go through that process. And that's, part of why the faith crisis is so traumatic. But let's see here. This is simplistic. I probably need to come up with a better metaphor than we're seeing right here. But we're just going to use it for now. All right. So now let's look at something.
I'm going through an infinite chicken or egg thing in my head right now, thinking of all of them.
Yeah.
But
well, tell me about that. So is there another way to conceptualize this now? Like, would you arrange these things in a different way? Would you use different bubbles? Like, how would you? Because this is just.
No, I think it makes sense I think it makes sense in an individual's. I'm kind of more thinking like the evolution of the human race, which I think it also kind of reflects that. But I've listened to some people kind of describe, especially kind of, it seems, I can't think and I can't speak for the entirety of the human race, but it seems like that's the same process of waking up of the human race to what we're all doing here. It started with a dogma, and that's how we started organizing. Although I've heard some people kind of describe it that the dogmas came out of narratives. I mean, that's one of the reasons books and stories work so well, because the narratives help make the dogma. So it's I heard a couple different
Hmm.
Eastern Orthodox people kind of talk about that their entire dogma is built around narratives, which are all have to do with like processions and patterns and running through those. So it's like the storytelling created dogma.
Hmm.
So I'm just kind of in this infinite thing of which came
Yeah.
first or
Well,
not,
I think
but
so. So that's that. I think there's some truth to that. So you've got this ideology in Mormonism that there are these prophets that declare God's truth. And so the narrative that we are all children of God on earth, subject to the authority of prophets, held accountable to our obedience to the prophet's articulation of God's will. But those prophets are now a wellspring of new dogma. And that new dogma feeds back into our ideology. And, there's like a really good example of this in my own life where I talking to one of my brothers a few years ago, are gay people born gay, or is that a choice born out of iniquity? And of course, at that time in the Mormon teaching was, yeah, I mean, it's a choice born out of iniquity, and so then a few years later, after the prophets had normalized and accepted the idea that gay people may actually be born that way and there's a natural component to it, then I asked my brother again, and that's his new way of thinking. And I could see how his ideology was shaped by the declarations of the prophets, which ideas were
it
allowed
came
to be incorporated.
it came down from authority, huh?
Yeah. And so that authority that's behind the dogma becomes very important. And it may be that there's a better way to conceptualize these things, but this is just how it popped into my
I
head. So now
I
let's,
I like it. I like it for like the concept you're talking about. The other thing I was
okay.
thinking about though is just the concept of what you become cognitively aware of, or think you
Mm,
become cognitively aware of. And I think at some level you as a person think you first kind of start becoming cognitively aware of your identity, and then you
mm-hmm.
are able to say the words of I'm a Mormon, like a little kid can say I'm a Mormon, I'm a
Yes.
Mormon person.
Yes.
And then later they can start saying, well, my ideology is this, and then they look at it
No.
hard and say, well, my dogma is this, and then they can say, well, my story is I'm going to do this. And that
Yep.
kind of comes with like higher cognitive thinking, where even though those things form them from the soup they were born in, the
Mm-hmm.
awareness in their own brain seems to kind of go in reverse order, like a little bit, but or at
No,
least what they
I
think
love
is
that. I
true.
think, yeah, I think you've hit on something that's important to realize, that is just that when we're young and we're, our identities are shaped by the soup, it's all around us. We don't even realize that the things that we are being told may or may not be true. We just accept it all because we have this inherent trust for our parents. And there's some evolutionary advantage to that evolutionary biologists might say is why it's in our psychology to have that level of trust there. But it just comes from, having not having these higher critical functions in our mind to step back and say, well, wait a second, why do I believe these things that shape my identity? Are those things actually true? And there's a step, there's a threshold where you go through where you are able to actually do kind of that meta introspection about, why do I look at things the way I look at? Is that something that is authentically me, or is that a tool that I was handed by somebody else that I never even questioned or realized that I was using it, or had other tools that I might have at my disposal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a little bit of what some of the waking up type nightmares
Mm-hmm.
that Mormons or post Mormons go through is I'm a Mormon. My story's always been this. I go on a mission. It's what I do. And then, well, what's your
Mm-hmm.
ideology? I don't know. And then they look it up and then look a little deeper and then wait, what dogma this comes from? And so it's like it's reverse.
Mm-hmm.
It's reverse understanding what this says created them, and I think that's
Oh, I see what you mean. So they get to the mission and they're existing solely at the level of the narrative and identity. They just know who they are and they're on a mission. And then they
yeah,
start getting challenging questions. And then they're like, well, wait a second, I need to know what I believe. I need to know why I believe it. And they study back and they start realizing that there are a set of ideas, some of which are built on
exactly.
dogma. And when you challenge, you're like, wait a second, why do I believe that? And so it's that backward working from where
So
you operate in that young frame of mind.
exactly. So you were asking me earlier what my experience was. That's kind of what my experience was. I mean, I think I
Mm,
identified and told myself the story as I go on a mission before I actually kind of really knew what all the details were. And then I started finding out the details. And even on my mission, just finding out the details of just the ideology, not the dogma, I started going, what? You know, and it worked back and worked back and worked back until the internet showed me more stuff about the dogma that I didn't know was, so
Yeah.
it was a reverse engineering of what you're describing as having engineered me.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of how I'm trying to go back to the root that gets you to where you are. And it makes sense then that where you are, if you want to understand that, you have to go back to the root. But then if you realize that that root is illegitimate or could be replaced by something else, then the repercussions of that, go reach all the way back to your narrative and identity. So you've got Mormons who go through this process. Some people would call this deconstructing. They're going back and looking at their ideas, where they come from, whether they are actually legitimate, and whether there's any other way to conceptualize those things, any other puzzle pieces they could fit in. And once they deconstruct their faith, is a common phrase that you'll hear, then it totally blows that apart, and they now have to create a new narrative and a new identity. So then you'll find people who very quickly adopt atheism. And so that then changes their identity. No longer are they gods in embryo with a divine purpose that includes multiple, infinite children on infinite planets or anything like that. They are a single organic creature living a solitary life on this planet, and they've got to make the best of it while they're here. And so that now changes their story. So suddenly things that in the past they may have said, well, in the next life, it will get better. And so I can put up with these challenges and these stressors now. Now that story is totally different. Now it's, I want to try to make the best of this time while I'm here because this is all I have. Yeah. And so, that type of thing can help you understand maybe why people in the ex-Mormon realm seem to operate a little bit differently when you're talking about ex-Mormons. But I want to do something different now, unless there's anything else you want to say about this,
No,
which
just that
is,
I know you were just saying that they call it that. I don't like the term deconstructing just because
yeah,
I know it to mean other things. But like wish it was called like reverse engineering or something like that, because I think
yeah.
that's kind of more the concept of undoing, whereas deconstructing in my mind means different things.
So give me some sense of why this would not be deconstructing, because I think you're referring to the, was it
Academic
Foucault or
use of
Derrida?
deconstructing. Well, there's two. I mean, there's kind of like the gender theory level of deconstructing, and then there's the queer theory of deconstructing, and then there's the deconstructing of the
Mhm.
Derridian level. Derridian is that he was a structuralist, which it had way more to do with language. So it's kind of just it's more about teasing out what words mean and do and can do and can't do. So it has that element to it. And then the queer theory is about purposefully blurring categories. Yeah.
Mm. Okay.
So it's um, like if we were to deconstruct this on the Judith Butler level, we've kind of been doing it a little bit, but we'd kind of talk about how dogma bleeds into ideology and it bleeds into narrative and bleeds into, and there's no real categories. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like a technical academic term for different actions than undoing a belief or
Right.
like people kind
I
of think of
find
it as
that,
like deconstruct, take down the building, but it's not
yeah,
taking down the building, it's other things. They're both
yeah.
kind of more things that bleed stuff. They bleed things. The Derrida bleeded, bled out the words, and Judith Butler bled out the categories, and whereas post Mormons are using it like take down the building, type
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Well, it's an interesting distinction, because I know when you listen to a lot of the fairly prominent podcasters in the ex-Mormon world, you hear that term deconstruction quite a bit. And a lot of times these are people who've gone through liberal arts education, and so they've been introduced to the way that language was deconstructed and the way that structure and categorization was deconstructed in those modes, and then find an application for it here. But I find that most of the people that are going through this process, when they say they're deconstructing their faith, when I think about what they're doing and hear them explain it, it really is kind of going through this process of tracing down what you believe to its roots and then trying to figure out if
I
they're
agree.
legitimate.
And if I was to be fully Deridian, well, not that I want to claim that or anything, but words have their own life. They've become a different
Yeah.
thing. So if it's already being
Mhm.
used that way, it already exists as that too. So
Yeah.
and
And
that's
that
true.
defines what
It's
it
just
is.
true. It
But it can
it
be all
means what
these
it
things
means
at
now
once.
that people use it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now I want to bring up. So now that we've talked about these things, I want to bring up a new tab. Let me see if I can share this now. If I hit share, stop screen, share, and so there's a documentary on HBO called "The Cult of Cults." Have you had a chance to watch it by any chance?
Is that the Scientology one?
That is the Heaven's Gate one.
I don't think I've watched it, although I've watched Heaven's Gate stuff before. I don't think I've seen
Okay,
their version
so
of it.
if you have seen anything to do with Heaven's Gate, as a refresher, this was in the 90s, I believe. Somebody made a phone call and they discovered that there were something like 30 or 39 bodies in a mansion in a wealthy part of town. When they went in, they found that each of the bodies, in some sort of ritualistic way, had been laid down, covered with the purple cloth. They all dressed similarly. They all had similar haircuts, and they had all committed suicide at the same time. And there was a big media frenzy about it. They were technically savvy for the time. They actually had posted a lot of their doctrine on webpage. They had the money for that facility because they actually had a business creating web pages for companies.
Wasn't
And
that
one of the
page
things that they
still
did,
active? Like,
it's still active today, actually,
wow.
because not everybody in the group committed suicide, and there are still believers who exist today who continue to maintain it. Um, this video that you see here, where you have these two people that look somewhat androgynous, are sitting in front of a very natural setting and talking to the camera, is iconic for Heaven's Gate because they left something like an hour-long video where every single one of these people spoke to the camera, speaking to us who are going to see and discover what they have done. And they're explaining that we may think that they've committed suicide, but that is not what they've done. They know that there are creatures of a higher level of evolution, higher than human, who are arriving in a spaceship in the tail of, I think, is the Hale-Bopp comet, and
Wow.
that they were graduating to that higher level of existence, that next level of human evolution, by shedding their bodies. And so they remind the viewer multiple times, I'm not brainwashed. I'm not in a cult. If you want to think that I'm brainwashed, then that's fine, but I know what I'm doing and I'm happy about it. And so you can, when you're watching these people and they're saying that, you have to understand that they have an identity and a narrative. They are students in a classroom learning how to achieve the level above human. The story is that they are going to follow their leader. They're taking all of the actions that are necessary to earn and be worthy of that graduation to the level above human. And the culmination of that will be in shedding their physical corporeal bodies. And that's their identity and their narrative. And when you watch the documentary, you can see the ideology that shapes all of this, the concept that there are creatures that are more advanced than human that are out there that have tried to bring their truths to the earth, that Doe and T, the religious leaders who formed this classroom, are the ones to convey those truths and usher the select and chosen few into that mindset. All of these things are the ideology, but all of those assertions, the authority that they claim to pronounce those things and to shield any of those claims from question, many times because the claims themselves are non-falsifiable, there's no way to disprove them, then you can see how the dogma shapes the ideology, which provides them with their narrative and their identity, which led to them not with guns pointing at them, forcing them, but choosing of their own free will to take this act. And one of the things that this documentary does that is brilliant is it has these animations where they bring the story, the narrative, what these people believe is going to happen to life. So you can see kind of the glorious thing that they are envisioning awaits them. And let me see if I can play that a little bit. Let's see here.
That is just a gateway, just a doorway.
Okay, thank you. This was the last log that was used when they signed out before the suicides. And they wrote little comments about when their ETR, estimated time of return, and say things like bye or never, question mark, hasta la vista, baby.
We hope that we took advantage of the time that we had incarnate in these human vehicles.
I'm going to pause it here and talk just a little bit because there's copyright algorithms that will immediately flag this and take it off. But we've seen now, that last clip was them just saying, okay, here we go. And now they've signed off because their lives were very regimented, as you'll find in many of these high demand groups. And
How many pulled it off? How many did it?
I think it was over 30. I forget the exact number. It was quite a few. Okay, let's keep going. I have to press play here.
And will be of better service to the next level because of it.
If you want information about us, and lower forces don't interfere, you can find it at our site on the internet, www.heavensgate.com.
And one last thing we'd like to say is 39 to beam up. Thank you.
Okay, so it was 39 of them. Now, they're giving in the captions here the real name, the birth name of these individuals, and then a weird combination of letters in quotation marks afterwards. And that's because part of the ideology and identity of this group was to give people new names, all of which ended in ODY, but then had different triplet letters beforehand. And you can see how the fact that they're giving them a new name gives you insight into the reality that this group understood the importance of identity. Because when you take someone's name and you remove it from something that's rooted in their family, in their original way of thinking, and you give them a new name, you're uprooting that identity and you're claiming that identity within the group. And so it creates a mental division between the things that they may have believed or accepted before, between the support network that they would have had before and what they have in the group. And so this concept of the importance of identity and how it can break you off from other systems of thinking, other ways of thought, and really kind of keep you trapped in this prison of narrative belief. I mean, narrative identity and ideology and dogma is really important. And they made a unfortunately effective use of it. When she said 39 to beam up, that was in reference to what they thought was going to happen. And this is what they thought was going to happen. The exit. That's an exit from human existence. Just seeing that animation where you're seeing in like these tangible terms what perhaps was going through their minds about what they were doing, and that they were going to evolve from these human creatures into these enlightened beings that were at a next level above and beyond human, that had powers that we could not even imagine of. Now, that narrative, that identity that drove those actions, you wonder if at any point in the pathway that they got to where they were willing to take the substances that ended their life, if they had been given an opportunity to step back and say, wait a second, I'm operating, I'm living in this soup where I believe that this is who I am and this is my purpose. But why do I believe those things? Who brought those ideas into my brain? And let's look at them and then see, are the ideas themselves legitimate? Is the person who brought them into my mind, is his authority enough to legitimate those ideas if they're not testable? and you can see how if one of them had the opportunity to step back and examine those things and go through this process of deconstruction, they could have prevented themselves from the abuse of acting on false beliefs that are solidified and calcified by dogma and ideology and the intoxicating allure of the identity and the story that they give you, because those identities and those stories are attractive. They hold sway in the minds of the people because they give an inflated sense of self-importance. They feed our ego. They give us a sense of purpose that is almost scary to imagine a life without. And so those are the things that kind of hit me when I saw that. You haven't seen this documentary before?
Not that one, but I remember reading about them years ago. Have you heard of the rapper Lil Uzi Vert?
No.
He's in the group Migos. I mean, they're pretty big and all that stuff. He did like a whole album based off of their website and all that sorts of stuff, and then it started floating around the internet like 4 or 5 years ago. Might not be that long, but then through that, a bunch of people all over the internet just kind of started researching what these guys did. So it was just kind of passed around for why is this guy talking about that and spreading around. If you think about it, his rapper name, he's a big rapper. He's pretty famous. We don't know him nowadays, but I mean, he's as big as like Snoop Dogg back in the day. But his name is like Lil Uzi Vert, like Lucifer, Lil Uzi Vert.
Oh, okay.
And all his stuff he bases it around that stuff. But this stuff floated around that time, and everybody looked into it, and everybody went and looked at the website to see that it was still active and talked about it. But what was their method of killing themselves?
I forget if theirs was an injection. I think theirs was a particular cocktail that they drank and then laid down.
Just like
if
James
I recall
now?
correctly. I don't quote me on that. It's been a little bit since I saw the documentary, so I would have to go back and review it.
So I remember hearing about it. I thought some of them, and one of the ways it's still active is like some of them stayed behind or something, and still.
Yeah.
And
yeah, there's one guy in the documentary itself who kind of gives the perspective of the believer, and he continues to be a believer.
Yeah, so I came across it and looked at it all. I never watched them interview. It's really weird watching interviews of people who did that. But yeah, there was a moment there where I stopped and thought, I went on a mission, and I didn't want to go on a mission, and I went on one and did a whole dang mission. And I knew from 11, 12 years old I didn't want to go, and I went and I did it. And I had a couple companions say that some of their biggest testimonies came from knowing how much I hated the mission and how much I tried. So I still tried and still went and still hard, but I was kind of pretty honest that I didn't like it. And but I went, and there was some sort of feeling in that like, here I am doing the thing that I guess I got to do and don't know how to do, but it's what I got to do because it's part of. And that's why I wonder, like, boy, would I have done something that brash, if I was
yeah,
if I was pressured into it by all the same things,
Yeah.
2 years versus death, but it's not
Well,
that different.
And you can see where people make choices that are less drastic, but maybe damaging to their family, informed by the same ideas.
Oh, yeah.
What the choices they make, for example, if somebody leaves the church and then the family member shuns them and they're no longer welcome to family events, they're seen as diseased or outsiders or fallen or wicked just because they've chosen not to, stay in the church. Well, that choice to shun them is informed by this ideology because you're told that's the right thing to do by your leaders. And so these things still have consequences. It doesn't have to be group suicide that shapes these things. And just in the same way, somebody who is struggling with the reality of homosexuality, who is inhabiting the ideology, the identity, the narrative that Mormonism has provided in the past, would have a great deal of issues of self-worth and self-loathing because of, in the past, when they've been told that is something broken or inherently wrong about them. Now we're seeing some improvement in the way that particular struggle is characterized in Mormonism, and they certainly have more progress to make in that regard. And so that's a good thing. Okay.
That's probably off subject. I was going to ask a question on that. I brought up in the last podcast you had on, it was one of the times I thought I misspoke because I meant something different than how it came out of my mouth, is that I was wondering why different people with that in their lives who are Mormons, who come out as gay and whatnot, and I said you can leave the church, and usually when people say that in that concept, they're saying it in the sense of leave the church alone, like poor church, and I didn't mean it like that. I meant like poor you, leave it alone. Like you can leave it behind. And there's something about me that, like, I mean, I somewhat identify with the heritage of Mormonism and all that sort of stuff, but it hasn't been like that hard for me to say, okay, bye, you guys do your stuff. But I wonder why, especially after that, so many, not so many, because I know a lot of them ultimately don't, but so many of them still want to try to identify with it and stick with it and tough it out and
Yeah.
try to make it work.
Yeah. I mean, if I was to put myself in those shoes, I think, there is so much that goes on around all of these things that we're talking about, in addition to the sense of purpose and belonging that you get when you're in a group like that. You do have all of those social supports, your friend group, the people who are there to pick you up when you fall down, your family, and doing a cost benefit analysis of what it would mean to break away from those things is hard. And especially when I think there's a lot, if you never confront the difficult, tough parts of the foundations of Mormonism, there's a lot of meaning and purpose and belonging that the church brings just by nature of it being so inclusive of people. And many people get a lot from that. And so it is even more to give up from those points. Now, people who've never felt like they fit in the Society of Mormons, sometimes it's cliquish, sometimes you're not in the clique and you kind of feel rejected by it. Well, it may not be as hard for someone who hasn't gotten as much benefit from some of the social elements of it to leave. And so it's kind of why I agree with the people that say, for whatever reason, people that choose to stay have some valid reasons to choose to stay. And you may look at it and say, well, why would you continue to torture yourself with that? But that's kind of the beauty of them being able to choose for themselves and test their own,
I mean,
act on their own priorities.
I don't think they for sure can if they want to try to do that. It's more like a thing, like wondering of and some of them, as as everybody knows so much, they say, I'm going to try to stick this out and make it work in 3, 4, 5 years. They move on from that. But
yeah. Well, and then on top of that, there's also this phenomenon. We have the people who know that it's not legitimate but stay for social reasons are these physically in, mentally out. We call them PMOs. But then there's also people who feel like they don't belong among the saints, and they may even separate, stop attending, but they still believe. They just don't see themselves as worthy to be among the saints. And these are people who are physically out but mentally in. So they're called POMI. And those are people that may actually be struggling with a lot because they feel, because of whatever sin, whatever natural inclination that they have, that they are not worthy to be among the blessed and true people. And so they live almost like a life of isolation and hermitage because they continue to judge themselves according to the standards of the church, even if they don't associate with the church, but they've never actually gone through and done that examination of why they judge themselves to be broken or to be on the outs, and seen that their whole judgment of themselves may be based on illegitimate claims. And so that, that's a tough thing to exist in. And Steve Hassan, who himself was a survivor of the Moonies, has talked about this concept of people who are kind of in isolated prisons by themselves without the sense of belonging with their people. And they may even step up and defend the group even more fiercely because they see themselves as maybe getting a little bit of redemption from the act of defending the group, even though they themselves don't feel worthy to be in it. So it's really complicated.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it kind of stems for myself. I don't know if you went through. I mean, I know all Mormons do. When you end up leaving, there's major social pressure from family and all that sort of stuff that you worry about. But it felt like for me, I didn't. I always fit in Mormonism. I still fit in that's the weird thing is like I can camouflage around Mormons very well,
Hmm.
um um but it just kind of felt like an identity level inertia that just made me not be able to keep. It's just not going to keep. I'm not going to keep participating in this. It I can't even remember it so long ago, but it wasn't like overnight. I just like left one day or something like that. But I slowly backed away, slowly got out of it, slowly kind of let people know I all the way wasn't into it. I had a weird thing where I had an ex-girlfriend out me to my parents as an ex-Mormon, but
Yeah.
uh, and that was the only real kind of day or two of a clashing. But other than that, like it just seemed like I would call it an identity level, maybe narrative level. Just you just can't keep being in it, and I don't know how people hold it up. I mean, I guess it's holding on to a strong narrative or something, but I don't know. Maybe I'm playing with these narratives versus identities in not very scientific ways or
No.
specific, but it just felt like it just felt like it happened. Like just by being that identity, there was so much effort to keep trying to stay in, and so it
Well,
kind
I
of
mean,
had to be.
there's an element to this that I think might be fun to play with, and that is that when you inhabit a shared identity, and what I mean is a shared identity is that everybody in the church or in the group or in the ideology kind of gets to have a similar identity because it's informed by these same ideological things, but that identity now carries a performative element. And if you want to stay in society with other people who share that identity, you have to perform that identity. And if you go through the process of doing whatever recalibration or exploration of the ideology that you took your identity for granted before, and then you realize that that's not you, but you want to remain in those people, now you've got a split internally where you may feel pressure to continue to perform according to that identity and what you know is expected of you, even though you feel inside something different. This is just a different way to frame what people do when they kind of have to play the role, put on the right face, say the right words, say the right prayers, even though internally they don't feel it. But that there's a stress that goes along with that. It's kind of like a type of dissociation that some people may feel more intensely than others, where they can't feel like they're being authentic with the people that they care about the most in their lives. And it can be stressful, and it can make you feel fake and make you feel like you're somehow cheating yourself, or that people around you don't really know you. And so it's an internal form of isolation. And I think some people would be so um, allergic to that circumstance that they just have to break with it, and they have to come out and either just be who they are and let the chips fall where they may, or step out of that society that and try to find a new community that is able to accept them.
And some people keep it up forever, or do you think it blows
Yeah.
up sooner or later?
No, I think there's some people who, for whatever reason, are able to keep it forever. We have the story of the general authority that Grant Palmer met with, who secretly knew that the church's claims were not true, but he felt like there were so many people who looked up to him that he didn't feel like it was an option for him to be authentic publicly to how he really believed, and he went to his grave that way. Um, you know, I think anyone in that position has the power to create their own narrative, their own story about how they fit in that environment, and they can kind of play. That's the thing about this whole concept, is that no matter where you are, you can kind of cast the narrative for yourself in whatever way you want. There's some power to that in coping and dealing with things. Um, the movie Life is Beautiful has kind of an example of this, where you have the character and his son that are in this concentration camp, and he could choose to frame it as this terrible, horrible thing for his kid, but he realizes he has the power and ability to, within his reach, recast what's going on in some different way so that his child experiences it differently. And it's in the realm of fiction, but it speaks to that power that each of us have to reconceptualize who we are in whatever environment we are, and that there's some psychological element that there may be a way for that to give us a degree of resilience or a degree of purpose or a sense of autonomy and choice, even in circumstances that we don't have any control over. So that can be a tough thing, but that's probably outside of this discussion. Okay, so we've looked at Heaven's Gate. Of course, we have our background of what it means to be a Mormon. What do you think? Because I think these are interesting to look at from the religious perspective, but ideologies, identities, narratives, and dogma exist outside of the world of religion. So if you were going to say, if I was to ask you, like, what is a non-religious example that we could analyze this from? Is there anything that jumps to your mind as like ripe for this type of examination?
Dogma that you wouldn't put in a religious level, or
Yeah.
ideology.
I mean, the things that
politics.
Yeah. So there's the political realm. Okay. So when you think about like who out there in the political realm, I think Republicans would say, oh, it's Democrats, and Democrats would say, oh, it's Republicans. So let's not stay with the Overton window people. What is like the margins that we can point to and say, I mean, QAnon comes to mind.
Of political actors who take it as dogma. I mean, yeah, maybe you go back in history. I mean, ones who fought wars just for their politics and died for it, and on all different sides. I mean, it might be easier to talk about the past than current day, but
Well, okay. So if there, I guess, is there a cult-like element? Because I think you kind of summarize the way that these things take over an individual's mind as culty or whatever. And I've certainly heard like our understanding of how undue influence works was originally formulated by Robert Lifton, who interviewed survivors of the Maoist revolution in China. And they talked to him about what was going on in the culture, in life in China, that led to this ideological movement sweeping through the nation, causing disintegration of their cultural and civic institutions that had existed for hundreds of years.
That's absolutely a good one. Yeah. The Maoist revolution.
So the Maoist revolution, I think there's a lot that we don't know about it just because it's so disconnected from, we're not educated so much in history. We haven't read, generally American students haven't read, Mao's Little Red Book, or maybe even know what that is, or understand the extent to which struggle sessions and executions and everything that went along with that in China. But was there an ideology driving it?
Well, exactly. That Little Red Book you said, it's coming, the dogma, it was coming from an authority. They looked at Mao almost as if he were a godlike figure, and he put out that Little Red Book, which was just a bunch of little sayings, but also kind of delineating out the ideology and dogma, blurring those two
And
things
what
together.
kind of identity and narrative did that bestow upon the agents that transformed their society? Because it was, if I recall correctly, it was a lot of the college students, the young people, the Red Guard, who took this ideology and turned it into a call for action that, was following the edicts of their leader.
It was kind of the opposite of usually what you think of as ideology, the traditional and all that sort of stuff. It was revolutionary. It was a revolutionary ideology, and that becomes its own set of dogmas and narratives and identities,
Right.
And revolutionary identity.
Yeah, so that identity then that the young people would inhabit would be, we are going to save our society and our culture, and we're going to do it by taking all of the old ways of doing things that kept people in systems of oppression, and we're going to absolutely purge them and purge anyone associated with them or anyone that would defend them from our society. And in that way, we are the saviors of our society, and we are the transformers of our culture into a great and glorious future. And that aspirational thing of we're going to save our nation, we're going to save or transform the world, there's something that feeds the ego of people who want to be important, who want to make a difference, who want to feel a sense of purpose. All of those things are included in the ideology and the story and identity that it bestows upon people who accepted it.
Yep.
And it's been fun to listen to some of the people who escaped those purges, who escaped what happened in that country as they observe what's happening in America now, because they are raising the flag that there's something happening in America now that is echo or resonates with what was happening in that country politically, leading up to that, that moment in their history where revolution became the transformative element that it was, that completely overturned and destroyed all of their old systems and brought in, their Maoist revolution that was built on communism.
Yep.
And the same sort of thing where, it was done in the name of getting rid of oppressive elements, of looking out for the downtrodden, for the marginalized, for the poor. And we were going to, bring this great prosperity to everyone. That was the marketing, that was the idea, that was the promise. And so that promise then justified all of those actions, all of the deaths. And it did not deliver. It ended up, I think, people that study this and look at the death counts say, well, yeah, the Nazis were bad. You had 10 million die maybe. And then the Russians, they were kind of bad because of the Holodomor. They starved something like 25 million, maybe 40 million people. But then in the Maoist revolution, that's where you had hundreds of millions of people die, or 100 million people die.
Yep.
And so just from the moral toll, the carnage and the human toll of an ideology that takes over and places furtherance of the ideology over any other consideration of human well-being, you can see how powerful an idea or a system ideas can be to affect change on massive scale of society. So when we're playing around with these ideas and we're hearing these people who survived that warning us, hey, something's going on in America that led to this huge traumatic transformation and revolution in China that now has one of the most authoritarian governments that are out there, it's something to pay attention to, because these ideas and these ideologies do have tremendous power when they are combined with the purpose and meaning that it gives to people who take those ideologies on and allow it to inform their worldview.
Yeah, they take on a lot of the features of a religion. Some would just call them a religion. I remember back in the day when Christopher Hitchens would argue with it, people would bring up those things as like atheistic movements that became totalitarian, as Christopher Hitchens would, in his anti-theist ways, try to say religion was the cause of all evil. And one of his dodges was to just say, oh, well, it just became a religion, which is true. But I believe there's been plenty of people throughout history, Nietzsche being one of them, kind of warning this, saying as soon as you remove the religious level, you get that level. It's just gonna happen. At least that was one of his predictions. But it is kind of a bit like, as soon as that political level takes on the religious level, you're dealing the dogmatic level, which it always has, even when religion was there or not there. But when they marry up, then watch out, But
well, on top of that, I think if you do have a totalistic political movement that takes over, I think it's very natural that they would start to see religion as an enemy to the movement, because the religion poses a competing ideology that could give meaning, purpose, solidarity, and somewhat of a bulwark or a defense against the expansion of the totalistic political movement. And
Well,
so it
diffuses
becomes,
it.
yeah, it becomes important then for it to dissolve that. And we saw in certain flavors of communism that they even saw the family unit as something that threatened the state and people's allegiance to the state, because if people felt more allegiance to their family, then it was something that maybe shielded them from complete acceptance of the ideology of the state. And you could look back and say, well, you know, each of those things, the family unit, the church, each of those things did give a identity and story to people who inhabited those spheres that may not have been something that the political realm wanted to have, because the state wanted to have its, you know, complete worldview occupy the minds of each member of the constituent state. And I loved how in 1984 George Orwell makes this point, but he centers it even down to, in his case, the orgasm. And he has these movements in the world that he depicts where people are demonizing orgasm and sexual relations, because those things themselves, if you felt love and connection to another human and had the pleasurable experience of an orgasm, then it was a threat to Big Brother. It was a threat to the party, because there's an allegiance, there's an identity there that is somehow apart from Big Brother, and you might choose to have allegiance to your lover rather than to Big Brother. And indeed, that's the love story at the center of 1984, and it's the boot of the state completely stepping on Winston and his partner, that her name evades me at this point, but that was part of why that book was so powerful to me in examining these issues.
Yeah, it's a wild one. They obviously end up battling in the same realms for, I guess the word's totalitarianism, but just there's some level where you say Mormonism was totalitarian on a level, but then that political level is also a totalitarian level. So obviously they fight. And what is that? There's like some kind of Cirque du Soleil type group of Chinese people who it was just here in Utah recently.
Oh,
I forget
yeah.
what the name it is, but
Shen
that's
Yang
actually,
or something like that.
yeah, they're actually kind of refugees from China, and they initially were told that they were in good standing with Mao, and then they got run off and chased off out of there because it wasn't going to jive with his totalitarian view of how the world should be and should go. And but the thing is like it feels like no matter what, you're always playing with that level of, if you jump from one, you could fall into another, you know, not just as an individual, but as a group of people, you know, like you could jump out of the, like, say that same exact group that got chased out took over all the power in China. It's only a matter of time before that all powerful group starts acting in some of the same ways. And
And it's so ironic that you bring that up, because there's this article that's looking into that Shen Yang dance troupe, and
they get weird,
realizing that there's a whole lot of culty stuff going on where they're taking over the lives of the people who are in that.
There's no way out. We only
no
land and
well, that's the kind of thing where it's you're always going to have an ideology. And one of the blessings of kind of working your way out of Mormonism and realizing that these things exist, that all those psychological levers of undue influence, realizing that all those psychological levers exist, is that you can kind of defend yourself against them when you see them pop up in other realms. And And that's where, like, going through this exercise of saying, wait a second, where do I get these ideas from that define who I am, or that I'm using to now judge the world or operate in the world?
Well,
And
because
are they,
obviously, even if you did find a good one, say, there'd have to be constant tending the garden to make sure that it doesn't become the bad one, you know?
yep. Well, and that's what it is. And that's where it's kind of like you have to have a set of principles that you can be rooted in and operate from. And those principles are an ideology. But there's a difference between an ideology that robs you of your agency and makes you subject to some dogmatic assertion of authority, from an ideology that centers your authority within yourself and gives you the ability to remove yourself or to act independently of your own. And for me, that's kind of been the thing that I've tried to center. And when I've said on multiple podcasts, like, I'm not a joiner, I see joining something as there's some thing there that makes you subject to it. It's kind of like everybody wants to say, oh, I'm an ally. I'm an ally to this political movement of this marginalized community. And when you do that, you're broadcasting that you're aligning yourself with one particular thing, but what it also gives people a chance to do now is to use that as a lever against you and say, well, if you are an ally, you should do this, even if you don't agree with it, even if you think that those actions actually would harm the community that you're trying to be an ally for. If the ideology of that group points you in a direction, you now are subject to all of those controls that go along with that. And so it's a difficult thing to have. I don't join.
Yeah. I'll tell you right now, it gets like that in any sort of I mean, I kind of remember when I was young, I had a job at Walmart, a Walmart photo lab, and there was something about that place that seemed like it to me, the way they talked about their leader, Sam Walton, and you don't know it until you're working at the place that they actually talk like that and bring up the same. It
Yeah.
almost sounded like they were talking about Joseph Smith when they were talking about Sam Walton, and I'd kind of look around like, y'all just workers at Walmart, like, but you'd hear like the manager kind of talk like they believed it or something. You're like, you really believe that, or you? And but there's that. I mean, I can tell you, everybody knows in the workout world it gets like that, absolutely, and it doesn't matter what the realm is, it can get wild pretty quickly, but.
Yeah.
I don't want to shoot way off the reservation, but this is one of the concepts, the overarching concepts of Christianity that I kind of declare myself an atheist, I guess, you know. I don't know what to call it or not. I'm the agnostic atheist level. I don't hold to anything with such fervor anymore, but I like the concept inside of Christianity, if you look at it from like a larger level, that the idea of the Christ is the being that recognizes the tyrannical nature of the previous thing, and this being is here to update the thing. But they have to update it through respecting the old thing, but changing the old thing, kind of the Old Testament to the New Testament. And the whole concept of the Christ like figure is to be that being that can be the phoenix, that can look at the crusty old father system, repent for it, not hate it, you know, not come at it from just a completely cynical point of view. It comes at it from a point of view of loving it. But you know, I think I don't even know where I heard it from, but the concept is that being had to love the father's creation, whatever the Old Testament was, and only that being who could then repent for it. That ultimately they say that being the Christ wasn't repenting for just the sins of the world; it was repenting for the sins of the father, the sins of the sins of the old laws that were wrong, that weren't quite right, and updating them into something new, a New Testament. But then the Christ figure is supposed to be the thing that is constantly updating the system, and it's the method or the overall metaphysical concept of the method of updating morality. And that's what the Christ figure is, the morality updater.
So it's kind of it's not quite revolution as much as it is reform. It's like not throwing away everything.
It's Jungian. It's rescuing the father, rescue the father, which is it's brought up in like a lot of different things, like the Lion King or
Darth Vader.
Yep, exactly. But the concept is the father. Yeah, the father is the culture. The father is the dogma and the ideology, not just a person. It's that
And that
archetypal level.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking very Jordan Peterson now, but you're not supposed to say that, because if you bring up Jordan Peterson, then you're instantly
Well, it comes from
bro.
Jung, because that's one of the things about Peterson that kind of it drives me nuts, that it's such a buzzword, because mostly he was kind of more like a Malcolm Gladwell type guy who just pointed you to other people, and he's pointing you to Jung, and I think these are more Jungian archetypes, which are this one of the criticisms of Jung, and I agree with it, but it's true, is that that's more narrative level stuff. It's not, I mean, that's not like biological
right,
scientific psychology. That's narrative psychology, but
and that enters the realm where I struggled a lot with the Peterson Sam Harris debate, because I entered into that discussion rooting truth in objective reality, and really only examining objective reality on the question of truth. And I think by the end of that multi-hour discussion, I still found myself in that space, but I found that there was something to consider in terms of truths that exist outside of objective reality that have to deal with how society and how individuals navigate social relationships that are less objective, and that certain things, whether or not you can prove them or disprove them, seem to work better and seem to shape society.
Yeah, I came into it the Sam Harris side too, and came out of it stopping and double thinking things myself as well. And it's pretty simple. You'll still get people who sneer about it, who talk about it, but the concept of truth is bigger than empiricism.
Yeah.
The word is that word, and you can say we're getting Derridian about it because we're looking at the word. Let's get back to defining what the word true means and all that sorts of stuff. But that word is older than, I mean, empiricism kind of comes with Hume, even, that's 1600s or something. It's a modern word. True goes way back. The word true goes way back and means a million things. And but
well,
I always try to reconcile that and think of like concepts of like, could you make the statement the Book of Mormon is the most true book on the planet, make that make sense inside of that thing? And I can never square that circle. Like, no, I can't. I can't give that one. But
yeah, that's a little jumping the shark on that one.
Yeah. But
even in Mormonism, it's like it doesn't contain all the truth. There's no temple marriage. There's no polygamy. There's none. There's like a whole bunch of true that's in. If you accept Mormonism of true, that's not in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, so I frequently try to like give it like the best benefit of the doubt when I hear like a Mormon using it or whatnot. I mean, we all know the saying, the Book of Mormon is the most true book. Who said that? But it doesn't fill in that gap for me there, but it does fill in the gap for me of like thinking of it in the sense of the concept of true as my true love's love. True as the arrow flies. True as different. True as in aiming right and trying to do right, although that gets into, if you get into like the moral psychology of all that stuff, it gets into more chicken and egg stuff endlessly. But I really struggle with it when I listen to a lot of ex-Mormon podcasts, because frequently things will be defined as true and good, and I don't understand what that's based in, because we've deconstructed that, but then we go back to using it to
well, I want to do a future discussion where we address that particular question, because there's this moment in 1984 where Julia and Winston are talking, and both of them look at each other and they say, I want everything to be evil and wicked and dirty, and exploring what that means in the world of Big Brother and what that means in our world, because it's like, these are our protagonists. Why are they saying they want to be evil, wicked, and dirty? And but you have to look at what is defining goodness in the world that they inhabit, and what that represents. And it's really fascinating to go on that journey. But we'll do that for another discussion. What I wanted to follow up with in our last thing here, this is where it gets kind of difficult, where we've seen how an ideology and a religion can cause you to take drastic actions, like ending your life thinking that you're going to evolve beyond human. We've seen how it shapes the worldview of Mormonism. We've seen how the power of those ideas and how they can, on a mass level, transform the actions of large groups of people and completely upend a society in the Maoist Revolution of China. Now I want to go back and just say, how powerful are these ideas in somebody who is living in the choices that they make now? And that's where I want to go back to Heaven's Gate and that documentary. I don't have it queued up because I haven't been able to find the cue things, but if you watch the 4 episodes of that show, there's going to be a moment where it turns out that a significant number of the people who committed suicide had been castrated. And there is they mention briefly in the documentary, and if you read about this, other people have said that Heaven's Gate was among the most postmodern religious movements that are out there. And they conceptualize the human body as being this vehicle that they occupied during their time of schooling on the earth. But that vehicle then had aspects of it that distracted them from their real purpose. And they go a little bit into the psychology that may have informed why the leader Do incorporated this ideology into the movement, in that he himself was homosexual, but was the son of a pastor, and it didn't fit with the life that he had then. And so there was this internal struggle and demonization of his own sexuality that informed his purposes and what he injected into the movement. And at one point, they forbade sexual relations or any form of contact between the movements themselves. And he took the action. He said, if you really want to be pure, if you want to be able to have the degree of focus that you need to have, then we've got to remove the sexual organs from our body. And so the people who followed his ideology, shaped their identity, accepted this new dogmatic assertion of a new facet to their ideology, and it transformed how they conceptualized their own body. So they no longer see their body as being them. They see their body as being separate from them, and then they see parts of their body as being not in congruence with who they authentically are inside, specifically their sexual organs. And so they originally tried to fly to South America to have a surgeon do castration. Some of them succeeded. They ended up finding some doctor who was going to do it stateside, but they had to conceal certain aspects of it. The documentary goes into some detail on that. And in one instance, in doing that, there was a botched surgery that required them to go to the hospital. And that's where some of this stuff was made known. But that chapter in the movement showed that the power of ideology based on dogma to shape your identity, to disconnect you from your physical body, and to see your physical body as an enemy to your authentic self, the power of ideology is so powerful, it can do that to the point that you choose to have a medical professional remove your genitalia because it doesn't fit with your body as you perceive it under the influence of an ideology. Now, that sounds an awful lot like something that we are seeing be more prevalent in society today. And that is the experience of people who are trans. And I think just in the past decade, we've seen people who, the LGBT, the T is kind of a tiny T far away from anything else. And it really wasn't a big part of the discussion because we were focused on rights for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. but T has started to really make a comeback and has started to dominate the conversation. And I think justifiably so, there was a lot of the discussion that completely left them out and blanked them out in how we frame these discussions around people who have this concept of gender that does not fit their biological sense. I mean, their biological body doesn't fit their internal sense of who they are. This experience, though, with Heaven's Gate and the precedent that it set, where a set of ideas that are asserted on the basis of dogma can shape your own conception of who you are and create a wedge between your concept of who you are and your physical body to the extent that you're willing to have your genitalia cut off, is an important precedent, because it says that while we're considering the issue of trans people, we need to understand that it is conceivable that there are dogmatic systems of thought which can alter your conception of who you are to the extent that you would take actions like that. And the more that that is accepted as society, the more that people may go down that pathway. And so the question comes, well, how could we know if that is a significant element in what is going on in our society? And we already know that it's been difficult in the past to talk about the issue of trans people. And there's a great deal of sensitivity because we don't want to have happen to trans people what happened with gay and lesbian and bisexual people in the past. And that is where we spoke so dismissively and derogatorily about them that we didn't take them seriously. And there was a great deal of harm that was reflected in the lives of people who were struggling with that issue. So that's one side of the equation where you have to be very thoughtful and intentional about how you address this issue. Even raising the possibility that there may be an ideological component that could affect somebody's concept of who they are is dangerous, because people will say, well, you're invalidating the lived experience of trans people. But as I hope we've tried to explain here, a lived experience is the sum of your identity and the narrative that shapes your worldview. And we've established that that can be shaped by ideological terms. And so it's, the world that we inhabit is so powerfully affected by the ideas that we bring to the table that you just have to consider that and approach the issue understanding that can be a factor. Now that's kind of laying the groundwork for it. Much like in Mormonism, you can't really know much about Mormons unless you talk to ex-Mormons, really, because they're the ones that will tell you both the shiny parts and the hidden parts. And someone who's come out of Mormonism can talk to you about what it was like to be in that believing mode, why you acted on the convictions that you held while you were Mormon, and what the process of stepping out of that frame of belief and acceptance that shaped your identity was, and how it got you to a new position as you deconstructed those beliefs. And there is a tiny minority that is growing of people who were very active and vocal in being trans, who are now doing what's called detransitioning or desisting. And their stories have not been really public or distributed a lot because that fear and anxiety that we have of creating real harm in the lives of people who are trans that are struggling with the issues of that has led to a political climate where if you consider any other possibility than actually affirming and encouraging the trans identity, then you are complicit in any harm that anyone may invoke. And that's centering all of the concern on people who are occupying the trans space. And they are a marginalized community. And then beyond that, there's another marginalized community now of people who are detransitioning, who, when they try to come forward with their story, they are told a number of different things. They are told that they were never really trans, that they were simply trying to get attention, and that's why they occupied the trans identity for a period of time, and that they've somehow betrayed or they are fake, and they end up getting demonized. And areas where they go online to try to find support, whether it's Reddit or Tumblr or other places, they end up getting shut down and labeled as hate communities for simply talking about their experience. And one of the, I think, seeing how powerful ideology is into shaping identity that led these Heaven's Gate people to feel so disconnected with the gendered part of their bodies that they would want to cut them off. When you listen to detransitioners talk about what it was that got them into the identity of being trans and how that ultimately didn't work for them, even in some cases undergoing surgery and undergoing hormones, then it at least raises a warning flag that we need to really step back and make sure as a society we're examining this phenomenon and trying to make sure that we're, in the case of the medical profession, doing our due diligence in really looking at all the facets of the issues that people struggling with this have, because there are potential pitfalls where we may be doing harm to people if we fly off the handle and don't actually stick to the principles of peer reviews, evidence-based therapies for people who are struggling with real issues. Anyway, that's kind of like the line I wanted to draw with this. I know it was a big diatribe at the end, but this is a rabbit hole. Like, if you want to go down the rabbit hole, I would say there's a channel called Benjamin Boyce. He was actually one of the students at the Evergreen College when that thing blew up. I know that you're familiar with that, but he started a thing. He realized there were these people who were getting shut down all the time that had important stories to tell about their experience as young men and women entering into the trans ideology, trans identifying, living life in the trans world, and then eventually deciding it wasn't for them for whatever reason. And everybody's story is different. And then traveling outside of that and telling their story about what went on in the community, what went on in leading them to make the decision to identify, what eventually changed and shifted there. And you learn a lot about the power of ideas to shape our identities and the choices that we make. And we know how powerful they are just by looking at examples like the Heaven's Gate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I didn't know that was part of Heaven's Gate. That was a shock to me. I didn't.
It was to me too. That was one of the things I didn't realize in the documentary going into it. I learned that.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta watch. You said that's HBO. I gotta watch that one. I've followed Benjamin Boyce's channel all along. I came to it pretty early. I haven't seen every single episode recently because I know there's been a couple of those detransition stories, although I've seen a bunch of them, a lot with the different doctors he's interviewed who've worked with these situations for a long time, and it's a really good channel with all that sort of stuff. There, it's interesting because it does kind of take on some sort of a sense of like the same thing that you see in other communities that have become rigid, and then you have an exit situation, and then there's a whole place for people to go now to express their exit stories in certain sorts of ways, and it does kind of mimic that, like as it does in so many different areas where you start exiting something that was really, really rigid and all-encompassing like that.
And those same principles of shunning and othering and trying to silence those start to happen. It's one of those things where these are red flags that something that is rigid and ideological and dogmatic is at the root of what's going on, when if the principle is that people should be able to choose whatever they choose at any point, then there should be no stigma of somebody choosing to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And when that stigma shows up, then you have to go back and reevaluate what is going on in there. And I think particularly any time that it is affecting vulnerable populations who may be at a moment in their life where they're looking for meaning, they're looking for purpose, they're looking for belonging, and knowing that these communities centered around these identities that are informed by ideology and dogma provide all of those things. They provide purpose, they provide belonging, they provide support for the challenges that you have at a moment where you may not feel it, or you may feel outside of the norm. And so it's really, it's difficult, I think, particularly if you have family members who identify in these ways. There can be very unhelpful, unhealthy ways to broach these subjects, in terms of just telling people, oh, well, you're just a victim of an ideology or something like that. And that's really, it's not helpful. It's not really well informed about how these, how your loved one may feel. And it's going to be better to just kind of start from a position of listening and love and acceptance, and just, open yourself to different ways of being, but staying connected to your loved one. Because if this is the case for your loved one, they are going to want to have someone that they will feel comfortable talking to. Because if they do end up being one of these cases that end up detransitioning, just like when we lost the church, we lost a lot of our community, they're probably going to lose a lot of their community in that process. And so I would just direct, if you have someone in your family who is affected by this, if you're interested in learning more about it, definitely go online and listen to the influencers who are in the trans community and just see how they talk about these issues. You will learn a lot about it, but also make sure that you're listening to the voices of people who detransition, so that you can learn about that experience as well. And also listen to journalists and medical researchers who are trying to broaden the conversation. There's a podcast called Gender, A Wider Lens, and it's two health professionals, mental health professionals who work in this area, trying to boldly talk about these issues in ways that tend to get silenced online, but are important to talk about it. The whole issue of rapid onset gender dysphoria, even saying that as a actual diagnosis or an actual entity that exists, gets you labeled as a transphobe in the most ideologically rigid communities. And so that's, being able to talk about ideas and challenge them and test them is where you want to be. You don't want to be in an environment where ideas are forbidden from being brought up.
One of the things I'd say for anybody to pay attention to in any sort of situation where you're listening to people's stories and in those types of situations is think about, especially since we're talking ostensibly to an ex-Mormon community who's been through it, think about when you go and watch people's exit stories from something, from a situation, from an ideology, like pay attention to little things, to like how much they have to preamble, how much they have to give their bona fides before they're even allowed to move into saying what they think or feel about something. They have to give all, like, think about in the ex-Mormon world, everybody has to say, I was actually a believing Mormon. I really was. I went to church. I read the books. I really, really, really did it. I promise I did it. I promise I did, and then they're allowed to start saying their stuff. Think of why they have to do those preambles. We all know why they have to do those preambles. Because they're faced with skepticism for something. And that's just one detail. There's so many different details that can be the same, that you realize people are talking out to a community that's going to be rigid in accepting and hearing what they're trying to say.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's getting late and we've been through a lot, but I appreciate you being willing to kind of just chat for a little bit. Let's see. It's 2:30. I'm going to be.
You put my brain through a Rubik's Cube. You really did. That's good. That's fun stuff to do, because I'm thinking about, I have a million different thoughts on all this different stuff I need to do, but it would all go in a million different directions. But I think you corralled it into a cohesive direction, at the end there. But you got me thinking of 5,000 different things.
Well, this is good. Just like an exercise I find myself doing now when I'm like, okay, I'm listening to somebody talk about some thing that clearly means a lot to them. What does it mean to them in terms of, like, what's the story they play in it? How are they informed by these things? It's kind of an interesting, fun game to look at those things. But, you have to keep in mind you're still talking to real people and you want to treat them authentically and at the level of the conversation that you're at. So you can, just like anything, it can be taken too far. All right. Well,
anything could be dismissed too easily too. I mean, I do a lot
yeah.
of because even just in this might snicker just
Oh, well,
to
before you
say.
talk, since we're here still, I'm just going to put the phone number up. If anyone calls in, they can
Oh,
join
sure.
the chat.
Just
There's
to
only
say
16 people watching.
to out myself a little bit. I always sometimes joke that half of the first half of my life, the difficult thing for me to leave was Mormonism. So I was post-Mormon, but the second half of my life, the thing that was difficult to leave was postmodernism. I call myself a pomo, and
Popomo.
the joke of that is, I mean, I went to graduate school and studied all that sorts of stuff, and at some level, I kind of started thinking that this stuff was a little bit narrative heavy, to wrap
What
it into
was
this stuff.
what was the crack? What was the crack in your shell for that, where you started to think, well, maybe it's not everything they make it up to be?
Well, it was a lot like Mormonism in the same sense of like you read stuff all along and kind of like, what? This doesn't really make sense, because if you're actually reading the actual works, there was a lot of time back then that I had the same experience that I did when I was a young Mormon, reading some Book of Mormon stuff and saying, I don't think I understand this. And then later being like, oh no, I understood it. What I didn't understand was that I was actually understanding it. And it's the same thing that happened when I'd go through kind of like, if anybody's read, especially 20 years ago, what postmodernism was like, it was purposefully technically difficult in its writing and all that sorts of stuff. But as years went on, it just kind of realized that it was really heavily built up around the concept of trying to tear down the ideas of being able to get a good grasp on the reality on how do you know what you know. I mean, it was really, really, I mean, that's the fastest way I can sum it up. It's really an attack on how do you know what you know and that sort of thing. But in this same conversation and throughout the years, there's always little bits of things where even in that stuff, like you get little points, like they had points, Derrida had points. It's obvious in some of the stuff we were talking about here that the words get shifty and dodgy, and one person doesn't understand it, and that's part of the point of what he was making. And so I'm always kind of like, that's why you Rubik's Cube my brain up, because like you have me going like, there's always these little things where I'm like, yeah, this thing that I've decided I don't like, I see the point in it, and I see the point in it, I see the point in that, and it's an endless thing like that, and because there is
For me, the
points.
challenge, I did not make an academic study of postmodernism, but I felt like these ideas were informing enough of what is going on in our world that I needed to have some handle on it. And that's where trying to go back and learn about people like Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and Judith Butler was very enlightening to me, because suddenly I could see, okay, well, this is where it is shaping now the way people are talking, the ideas that are shaping how we conceptualize power dynamics, and the way that the focus on language is, why pronouns are important, all these other things. Because you wonder, where do these ideas come from? And there's two things that come to mind when I consider what I did in that. One of them is some of the concerns that drove their ideas don't have to only be rooted in postmodernism. Like, you can take the idea that people who have authority and position and power over others may use that to their own ends. That doesn't have to be some sort of magical alchemy that only exists in the realm of postmodernism. You can explain that in conventional, normal, modern terms, and it still makes sense. And it's something that you can incorporate into your analysis.
That's a great description. But just to go along with this conversation, what you had me thinking about it is that, like, I'd like to a la carte take and choose things, but even the things I pick a la carte, they're not true all the time. Sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not true. And most of what those ideology or those rigid dogmas become, even like postmodernisms, they want to say a certain thing is, this is always true, like this all the time, no matter what. And that's where it gets so like I can say, instead of just saying, well, that same thing can be described in liberalism or whatever, I've kind of gotten to a point where I can say that's described in postmodernism. So like I can use the postmodern term that doesn't, and the postmodern concept, but that doesn't mean that I have to be a dogmatic postmodernist now. Like, but that's kind of full cycle, because I also had to go through the time frame of being like, I hate these postmodernists. You know what I mean? And
okay, we got a call. Let's see if this is a real call.
Yeah.
Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
You guys are awesome and awesome for doing this. I just thought I was really interested in how you pulled those 4 concepts together, and I really appreciate you. I appreciate the talk about, you know, going on a mission, how that really plays into the 4 of those. So I just really appreciate you, and I'm having a hard time getting all my thoughts together right now.
Well, that's what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, it's where I am. It's almost 3. It's harder to articulate stuff. It's like doing drunk history, but it's just groggy, sleepy history.
You said it was the mission, like you related to the mission, you went on the mission?
Yeah, I did. I really related to you, Chris, how you were talking about how, you know, you really didn't want to go. I was talking to a buddy the other day, and we were talking about our experience with it. And, as a kid growing up, it's always like, I always remember from the time I was young, hearing, you know, in prayers, his parents telling you how to pray, like, okay, bless me that I'll through the gospel and go on a mission, go to college, and get married in the temple. And so even without physically or purposely with their words trying to force you to go on a mission, you kind of absorb that dogma that you have to do. And so even though it was something I didn't want to do myself, I felt that I was supposed to, and that I had to do it. And I realized I identified the way you said, I don't want to go. So I went. Stayed 6 years, worked hard, but it was a struggle, and it was a struggle dealing with the ideas, you know, that the individual mission presidents have. It goes to that leadership roulette that you end up with in the church.
Yeah, I'd say it was one of the hardest things I ever did, because I find out like all this time later that a lot of like people who didn't believe, and I always struggled believing. I never like believed very, very hard, and I tried my best. A lot of people went out there and had all sorts of fun, and sometimes I kind of wish I could have gone back and just done it more slothfully and something like that. But I can 100% say in primary, I refuse to sing I Hope They Call Me on a Mission. I know for a fact I would refuse to sing it. I'd sit down and I wouldn't sing it and say, I don't want to go on a mission. I have to miss 2 Christmases. Are you kidding me? And from a little age. And I still ended up on it. And Jonathan had me stop and thinking, like, if I was in that church, would I have just given myself the shot too? You know what I mean? Like, how did I end up on it? You know?
Right.
See, it's funny because like when I was at that nexus, I was, you know, it's either go on the mission, and if I was going to have to go on the mission, then I was going to have to confess to the bishop and the stake president. And like, there's all this, you know, I'm a teenager and I discovered BBSs and I had a modem, and so like I had all these things that like I wasn't going to confess that stuff. I was the Nephi, I was the golden boy. I don't need people knowing that I'm not perfect. So it's kind of like, so I had to have a legitimate reason to not go on a mission. And I had already gotten to the point where, okay, well, I'm in medical school. I'm going to medical school. I got accepted to medical school. So I'm going to medical school and I'm getting married, and that's what I'm going to do. But I had to have that, like, if I didn't have those in place, then there would have been no legitimate reason for me not to go. And I would have had to like go and either lie or confront my shortcomings with these authority figures. And that was not something I was wanting to do.
Well, yeah. So, you know, with that raising the bar that they did, what that did for me is it made me lie my ass bishop, take precedent. Until you finally sit in the MCC and you're like, well, I'm not going to be able to have the Spirit if I can't do this.
It eats your guts. It
dude
eats
in
your
the
guts
MCC
inside out. Yeah.
Everything that you've ever done. So,
Yep.
yeah.
It's the worst. And then you not only did since you were somebody who never wanted to go, you already thought you were kind of wasting your time, but now you're really, really wasting your time because you're also just a complete sinner anyway, and it's all for naught. And
Yeah.
so you're double wasting your time.
Yeah.
And you're
Yeah.
preventing families from joining the gospel because you're not in touch with the Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, there's something that you brought up that I think is important to talk about, which is parents teaching their children. A lot of times we as Mormons, or we as ex-Mormons, will say, oh, you're indoctrinating the kids. You're indoctrinating the kids. And then the response is, well, everybody indoctrinates their kids. Like you have to teach your kids, and that's indoctrination. Is there a difference between indoctrination and teaching your kids? And how do you define that difference?
Well, man, that is a hard question. I don't know where you draw the line, because you're gonna teach them something, and so I think if anything, you hope them to think for themselves, no matter what paradigm you're looking at. There's a guy on YouTube that does kind of these animations that talk about God and I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but he does this whole saga, and there's an episode in it where God comes to this guy as kind of the savior to bring free thought basically back into whatever was going on, and what stuck to me from that was he says, I picked you because of this moment. And he has this moment with his daughter where he tells her that she has to go to ask why.
I need you to repeat that. You broke up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He tells her what?
He tells her that she should go to school, or something to that effect. And rather than telling her that she has to do it because he's older and he's right and he knows what's best, kind of breaks it down and says, well, I guess you don't have to, but I think you should because I think it's what's best for you. And he explains why it's best for her, to follow the ideology. So I think about that a lot, and how I can incorporate that kind of thing into my parenting.
No, I think that's an important factor to consider. Okay, I think your line is breaking up a little bit more, so I'm going to say goodbye and see if anyone else wants to call. I appreciate you calling in.
Great. Well, thank you for talking to me.
All right, take care.
Nice talking to you. One of the things that
that question of teaching versus indoctrination is pretty important. Let's see what the next call is. I mean, we have more to say on that probably, but hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hi, great to be here.
Hey, what's on your mind?
I want to say how much. My name's Zach.
Hey, Zach. What comments do you have about the subject we're talking about today?
Yeah. Well, I think I totally agree that we need to kind of hold, if we look at Dogma as kind of an enemy, kind of system, and the alternative to that is sort of keep this open mind, be skeptical, if you will. But I guess just kind of bring up the question, at what point do we draw some, structure of our own ideology? And I think that really is just kind of comes down to the human, just the process of finding that out for yourself. And I I don't know. It's just, but these concepts, I think we need more of them in the world, as we're all so polarized.
No, that's a good point. I think, and that idea of being open and skeptical at the same time, I think is really a really great way to characterize kind of how I've tried to approach things after, having the church blow up in my face, and and knowing what to be skeptical of, I think, is an education. And so that's where early on, when I discovered that there were people who had made a formal study of mechanisms of psychological manipulation, was really helpful to me, because then I kind of saw that. And it's not like anyone who uses any of those things is immediately bad. We all use them to some extent. There's some that we don't, but there are some instances where they play a role in our lives. But just understanding them so that where the red flags are is really important. You have anything to add for that, Chris?
Of course, I agree. It's an issue and a problem. I think most people who end up out of religion start getting into some realm of trying to figure out what's next. Some people just individually, but then of course there's groups that try to make groups, and it seems like there's some sort of level that if there's some sort of intent to be like some post-religious religious group that just doesn't gel quite like religious stuff did. And some of that's narrative. I remember I read Thus Spoke Zarathustra a while back, if you've ever read it, and it's just gobbledygook if if you read it. But
That's Nietzsche, is that right?
that's Nietzsche. But what the whole book was is he was kind of trying to do a new Bible, you know what I mean? And he realized, like, if I made it kind of like this narrative sounding thing, then people could congeal around that, because they're not going to congeal around my long form philosophy, And
Okay.
it was a smart concept. It obviously didn't work. We don't know very many. Thus spoke Zarathustrians running around, but there he was on to something, and I think the post-Mormon community's onto it a little bit in some senses. Like, we don't have that same gel in the same way, and maybe that's also going to be kind of one of the things that keeps us from being dogmatic. 'Cause I think it still ends up happening there, but it always leaves me returning to be more than maybe other people, like thinking that it's got to be somewhat at the individual level, although you have to think out beyond that to your family and beyond that, and how to land on the right thing. I'm still sorting that out. I think we all will be forever, and part of it is constant kind of reexamination. But I think part of my constant reexamination is kind of, and I think it would be helpful if most Mormons did, and I know they do to some extent, stop and really think about the soup, like Jonathan said it, that we were brought up in, made us a little bit. And that doesn't mean that we can't unmake it or change it or work on it or update it, but it's also, it's in there. And and so we're already kind of working from a framework, and it's good to recognize that framework came from our past in some sort of level, and where we came from, and that doesn't at all mean go back to the church, or something like that. I'm not, or I'm obviously still trying to sort that out. It's something I've been thinking about and trying to work out for a long time. It definitely doesn't mean that I want to that I
It
find
doesn't matter if you go back. They're not going to keep you. They'll kick you out as soon as you opening your mouth up.
I got punted out anyway, but no, I'm not.
Hey, caller, have you noticed any, like, what have been the things that have helped you kind of avoid falling into other dogmatic ideological realms after Mormonism? Have you found that that's something you've had to really navigate and almost fallen into?
That's a great question. I think just the almost thrill, you could say, of being free from those mechanisms is enough to kind of want to stay free, for me. And but the problem is once you're free, you're alone, and for, say what you will about the church, it's so nice to not be alone in that you can share those things. But But I think for me, being free and wanting to stay free and stay careful is kind of motivation. I enjoy, even in the sort of solitude, I enjoy that freedom. And so that kind of answers that. But I think as humans, we're always building, whether it's just your own ideology that's a slow, careful process. But society moves on. The church is going to move on. Everything moves on. But yeah, I think being free, just to answer your question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. Something that I've found really helpful for me is to be very careful about how I conceptualize the truth that I operate from. Because there's this idea that you've achieved truth, but then that stops you from questioning that truth. And so science, everyone likes to say, well, the science is this or the science is that, but the scientific conception of truth is not truth, it's provisional truth. And that is truth justified by the data that we have at this point, but it's always open to further revision, further clarification by any future data. And so that same idea of provisional truth is what I try to approach my worldview in. So that includes that same open-mindedness and that same skepticism that you talked about. It allows you to reconsider the things that you've held, that you've used to guide you in your path, and hopefully catch yourself if you find yourself going down a road that you realize is not the one that you should go down. And I think on that, we've exited a realm where it requires your physical presence sitting in a pew or in a drum circle around some sort of charismatic leader in order for you to be swept up in an ideology that can take over your life. We now exist in a world where there is such a wide social media and internet-based way to connect with other people that the ideas themselves and the identity itself that is shaped by the ideas becomes its own charismatic center of a groupthink situation. And so whereas that former scenario where you have this charismatic leader is kind of a cult of personality around that leader, we have a cult of ideology or a cult of identity that is a new kind of danger that exists out there that people can get swept up in. And that's where you have to be even more careful just in terms of checking yourself and the movements and the groups that you get involved in and whether or not they are starting to have this dogmatic rigidity that kind of boxes you in. So that open, skeptical framework that you talked about in the call, I think is really important to keep in mind.
It's hard because
Definitely.
I think you have to kind of constantly be skeptical, but at the same time too, like anything, you can be overly skeptical and you can be overly critical, and so it's like a constant meta dance with that sort of stuff, and it sometimes is impossible. And then when you think about, well, then how do we make a group of people who do that? Like, let's all grab our pitchforks and our flames and go march on the hill and say we're going to constantly skeptically examine ourselves, and if not, if you try to, we'll attack you if you don't join us. But
we'll let the world know our peaceful ways by force.
Yes, exactly. So, but I mean, obviously, in this whole area, it's something that as I'm talking about it, I saying it out loud, it's obviously scrambled. I don't have it sorted, and I don't think most of the post-Mormon community has the figured out answer quite yet, but we're all trying to get there, I guess. And I don't.
Hey, we got a comment from Cardin Ellis. You need super chats. You're up late. You're hilarious,
What's up,
Cardin. Dude, if you would accept my friend request, then I could actually send you the link and you could hop in here, but you didn't.
I talked to Cardin a little bit on the Facebook, but he's a good dude. That's one of the things that, like, not getting like dogmatic and all that stuff is like those guys. They're smart guys, and they're already so like they got demonized as like a different side or something like that. And as I kind of start poking through all their stuff, it doesn't seem like such a different side to me, But.
Yeah. Well, that's been an interesting adventure to see a little bit more of their own lines of thinking and how it differs. Listen, caller, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your perspective. And I know it's late. I appreciate you being up and participating.
No, so good to have the opportunity. Keep doing what you guys are doing.
All right, take care, man.
All right, bye.
All right. Goodbye, Cardin. He probably went back to bed. All right, I'm going to get in trouble if I stay up too much later because I'm going to be useless tomorrow. All right, man. I appreciate you weathering this storm with me, and maybe we'll find enough positive feedback that we can have more free-form conversations like this.
Oh, thanks for having. It was hard. It was hard to keep up with you. It was a good. Not, I don't mean that in the way of I didn't understand you. It was you were making me think about a lot of stuff, kind of in that Socratic way of what are your definitions, and now you're realizing that your toes are in the fire.
And all these definitions are specific to this conversation, because if you talk to somebody else, then you're gonna have something different. Like I made a point to sit down with each of my kids and just ask them, like, what does ideology mean? What does dogma mean? Just like the same way where you were saying, like, you just want to define it in terms of how it hits you vernacularly, like what you've seen it tossed around as. And there's a lot of different ways that people understand those concepts. But it was helpful for me in my conversation with them to define them in the way that I have here, because I think once you do that, you start to look at the world and look at how ideas shape people and the choices they make a little bit more differently and specifically. That can help when you're discussing things, and it helps separating, again, the person from the ideology, because if you're trying to have a discussion about these controversial things, it helps you separate the person from the ideology so that you're not risking insulting them, but you're talking about and being critical of maybe the ideas that are held, which is important.
There's one last little concept that it just keeps popping up in my head, but you're talking about these sorts of issues, and it's been coming up in some other areas, but there's this concept of prophilicity, and I guess you kind of brought it up here in the talks about what's the video game, but in this new tech era of profiles and being a profile and being a different profile online, it's really bleeding into all this stuff in a new and different way. Obviously that all is kind of like obvious, but I don't think, maybe we all do, but we all have to realize that stuff's really changing how these exact same four concepts interplay with each other a lot.
Yeah. No, I've heard people talk about how dissociating your identity from your physical body is manifested in your avatar online, but that idea then gets infused a little bit into how flippant people may be on their discussions around the trans issue. And some people may say, oh, well, it's no big deal to have a surgery or to get on hormones. It's just like having a different avatar. And that dismisses a lot of legitimate, serious concerns that people need to have before they undergo any sort of major medical intervention like that. So, it's interesting how these ideas shape the way that we even consider these things. So, all right, well, I've got to turn it off at some point. So let's see here. Until next time. Next time.
Thanks for having me on.
This has been Talk on Things and Stuff, and I got to turn off the banner and then hit this. And until next time. Bye.